Hello, hello.
Hello, hello.
Can you hear?
So, very good morning to all of you. Dear students, today we are indeed blessed to have Professor N.K. Singh here. He will be giving you a lecture on genomic resources. So, I will give a brief, although many of you might have read his contribution, I will briefly introduce Professor N.K. Singh. N.K. Singh born in Rajapur, Mau, UP in 1958. He did his graduation and post-graduation in Banaras Hindu University, Varanasi. In both he obtained a gold medal. After that he obtained his PhD from University of Adelaide, Australia. He was there from 1981 to 1985. And later he also went as postdoctoral fellow in CSIRO, Division of Plant Industry, University of Adelaide from 1986 to 1991. Initially, he joined as a scientist at CFTRI Mysore. He served there from 1991 to 1994. Later, he moved to GP Pant University, where he served as associate professor from 1994 to 2000. And then after that, he joined the NRC Plant Biotechnology. Then now it is renamed as National Institute for Plant Biotechnology. Since then, he is serving there. Currently, he is National Professor BP Paul Chair, as well as the Director of NIPB. Many of you will be knowing his research contribution. The genome sequencing projects such as rice, wheat, pigeon pea, mango, and several other genome sequence project at NIPB and ICR is spearheaded by Professor N.K. Singh. They have successfully completed rice genome, wheat genome, and these tomato genome. These papers have been published in highly reputed journals such as Nature and Research. So we are harnessing the benefit of this genome. Indeed, from the rice genome sequencing, several markers have been developed, and we are also using the 50,000 K genotyping chip developed by Professor N.K. Singh. Besides the basic research in developing the genomic resources, he is also leading the QTL2 variety program in the country. So several elite varieties which are in the country, they don't have resistance to biotic and abiotic stresses. Under the leadership of Professor N.K. Singh, these varieties have been converted into the genotype which are highly resilient to climate, and they save water. So these varieties are being in different stages of development, and some of the varieties have been released for cultivation. So in addition to this, he has published large number of papers, and you will be happy to know that his H index is 63, which is very high. When we compare many Indian scientists, he will be one of the top scientists who have H index 63, and the citation is almost about 17,000 citation he has for his publications. So with this enormous contribution, he has been recognized by the national and international system. He has been awarded with the ICR highest award of Rafi Ahmad Kidwai Award in 2007, and he has also received in Norman Borlaug Award in 2015. In addition to that, he has received several awards of DBT, DST, and other organizations. To recognize his contribution, all the scientific societies of India, such as Indian National Science Academy, NAS, NASI, and in all the academies, he has been elected as fellow of all the academy. And he has also served as secretary for the National Academy of Agriculture Sciences. With this brief introduction, I welcome Professor N.K. Singh to deliver his lecture. Thank you very much, sir, for coming here, sparing your valuable time and encouraging the young minds. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Viswanathan. Already I have the mic here. And thank you for that very elaborate introduction. And I think that is a kind of a summary of what I'm going to present here. And good morning to all of you. You had a very comfortable stay. All of you had a good breakfast. It's very, very cold here in Delhi, but this place is comfortable, hopefully. So in about next 1 hour, I'm going to present an overview of the genomics studies which we are doing at NIPB, and also how we are utilizing the genetic resources and genomic resources for the rice improvement mainly, but I will also talking about some general broader informations. So at the outset, I would like to acknowledge the whatever work we are doing, the funding support from the mostly coming from the Department of Biotechnology, Government of India, and Indian Council of Agriculture Research. And whatever work I am going to present here to you, it is mostly collaborative work. Apart from what we do in our lab, we do a lot of collaboration with the national partners and international partners. And the number of scientists from my own institute and from IRI, we are very actively collaborating. A large number of research associates and research fellows like you have contributed, so I just want to acknowledge them in the beginning. This is the outline of what I am going to talk today. First, I am going to introduce the genomes and why we need to do decoding or sequencing of the genomes, why it is important. Then very briefly what Dr. Viswanathan described, the different genome sequencing projects that we have completed at NIPB under ICR. Then what is the importance of this work? What are the challenges coming up in this 21st century? The high-yielding varieties, the Green Revolution varieties, have certain limitations, and how are you going to correct that in the challenges of this global climate change. And I will describe a little bit about this QTL to variety project, where the product delivery has been made possible through a multi-institutional network. Then significant amount of time I will give on the search for new genes in the wild rice germplasm, and how we are approaching that particular resource, genomic resource, the genetic resource. And then some varieties which have been released and what are the future direction. Now to start with, what is genome? The genome, many of you will be knowing, and the definition, you will be giving a varying definition, but the genome was defined very accurately almost 100 years back by a German botanist called Hans Winkler. And he defined, the original paper was in German actually. He defined the genome as a complete set of genetic information present in a haploid cell of an organism, including its protoplasm. That means it includes the nuclear genome as well as the cytoplasmic genome. This is the complete definition. One complete set, not multiple set. That's why the haploid word is given, and including the protoplasm. It also includes the genes and the intergenic species, the repeat sequences. So the complete genetic information, including the repetitive part of the genome and the cytoplasmic, is one set of that is called genome. Now let's see why is the genome decoding or genome sequencing is so important. All of us know that it is quite costly to sequence the genomes, At least it has been very costly in the past. Now it is becoming cheaper. So what we gain by spending so much resources and money for that? So I have given you 4 points here, starting from the very basic to very applied. The very first is that once we have the complete physical map, genome is nothing but a physical map. Like when we talk about the genes are a factor, first described as a concept, some kind of factors they didn't know even. Mendel did not know what the genes are made of. And the distance between the genes were also in terms of the recombination frequency. So these are the abstract notions. But now we know that the genes are made of nucleotide sequences, so which is a physical reality. So when we have the genome sequence, that is a physical map. When we do the genetic linkage mapping, that is a genetic map which is an abstract map. It does not really exist there, but you make a map based on the recombination frequency. But the physical map you can even see in the microscope. You can see the sequence of DNA in the powerful microscopes. So once we know this complete physical map of the genome, and that corresponds with the genetic map. Once you have the physical map, you don't need to have genetic map because that will correspond with that. So then we can do the evolutionary and phylogenetic studies. We can try to understand that how different species are related to each other. These species could be crop species, wild relatives of the crops, or it could be animals, plants, microbes. Whatever life is there on this planet, it has a genome. And also, all of them have a common origin. That is the evolutionary concept, the Darwinian concept, that you can clearly see that when you analyze the genome, when you compare the genomes, you can see that how the different species have evolved from a common ancestor and how far back these lineages separated from each other. It is possible to see all of those things. So that satisfies your very basic curiosity of human curiosity of knowing about what we are, where we are going, what is the world around us. This is a very basic curiosity we need to know to satisfy our curiosity. But that is not just enough. We need to, any knowledge without application has no value. It is actually like a poison. If you simply have pure knowledge without any use, then there is no use of that knowledge. So the genome information, rather than apart from satisfying your curiosity, it has very, very useful things you can do with it. The first is the molecular characterization and high density fingerprinting of germ plasm resources. So as you know that for every crop species or every other species of plants and animals, there is a large number of individuals are there, which is called population, and their wild relatives are there, different varieties are there, which is called germ plasm. And usually the developing countries like India are very rich in germ plasm resources as compared to the developed industrialized countries who don't have much of the germ plasm there. And most of the tropical and subtropical countries are very rich in germ plasm. Usually they are also the less developed countries. So their north countries, what is called north-south, the developed country, they are rich in technology, but the developing country, they are more rich in the natural resources. And it is actually inversely proportional. As you will be developing, you will be losing your genetic resources very, very fast because you try to homogenize and become uniform. Even within the country, you will see that the less developed state has more germ plasm rich, and the state like Haryana, Punjab, you can hardly find any wild species. You will only find rice and wheat. So the germ plasm is a valuable resource which has been recognized by the International Biodiversity Treaty. So there is a value for the germ plasm. You can charge money from people who use your germ plasm. There is a right. But how will you going to prove it? Unless you have very high density fingerprint, unless you have any knowledge of the genome, the landscape, what are the markers, how you can prove that this is your germ plasm, you cannot actually claim your rights. People will take it and then you will not know who has taken and when they have taken. But having a very high density fingerprint is possible with the genome information, and then one can claim, just like in the paternity dispute and criminal cases, few markers are used, few DNA markers can be used, but there you have a suspect and you have the real criminal, so very few markers work there. But in case of germ plasm, people can make use of only a small portion of the genome and earn high income without acknowledging or without giving the original source of the germ plasm, any acknowledgement or any revenue. So for the molecular characterization is also required for the making use of that germ plasm yourself. There are different strategies that how you are going to cross the different genetic resources to mobilize this in the varieties. You need to know the genetic information, genetic diversity, how distant, how close they are to each other. So for those kind of things, we need the germ plasm, the genomic information. Then coming down the line, the genomic information is also very, very useful in the gene discovery itself. If anybody takes the germ plasm, your germ plasm, they are taking for the only one purpose, that is to find genes in that which they can make use of. There is no other purpose of the germ plasm. And so far, I don't know any example where scientists or human beings have created a gene. They have a copied gene present in the nature. They may have slightly tweaked it and modified, like with the genome editing and techniques like that. But we haven't created a gene de novo. All the genes which are present in the nature in the germ plasm, and all kinds of genes are there, and we have to search it. So while trying to find the gene which performs a particular function which will be useful in your crop improvement or for any other purpose, you need to have the genome information. Genome information is just like having a GPS. You search for somebody's house, some person, and you have the address and GPS, then it is much faster to search. Otherwise, if you don't have the map, it will be very difficult to search a person in city like Delhi or any big metro city. So it is useful in the gene discovery process. Then it is also useful in actually breeding. When we are breeding the varieties, breeding is nothing but the selection. You select from a population of the variation, you select the desirable type or reject the undesirable type. That is the breeding. So that selection process you can use DNA marker assisted selection. And there having genome information is very useful, whether you are using foreground selection or the background selection. I will show you some examples of those uses of the genome information. So as you can see that genome is the one complete set of genetic information present in a single haploid cell of an organism, including protoplasm. And why we need to sequence the genome, even though it is very costly? Because if you have the genome, you know the phylogenetic relationship among different species, including from human till microbes, how they are related. Then you can characterize your germ plasm resources, which is very valuable, so other people cannot misuse it without giving you the due. Then you can use the genome information to search for genes, to find new genes which you can use in the breeding. And it also helps you the breeding process itself. So it speeds, it accelerates the breeding process, and it makes it more precise. Also in your genome editing, as I told you yesterday very briefly, that for doing genome editing also you need to have the complete knowledge of the genome, because when you develop these guide RNA and probes, those probes have to be very specific. Then only the genome editing will be precise. If that probe is going and hybridizing to many places in the genome, then it will not be precise. So for that reason, we must have the complete genome information. Then only you can check that the probe, whether the probe that you have designed, whether it is specific or it is not specific. Very quickly, you don't need to read all of this. What I am saying that there is a timeline. If you want to decode a genome of any species, it is not that easy to do it. it has to go through different phases. And there are crops and the plant species at different stages of decoding of genomes and the genome information, what kind of information is available. So at the very basic phase 1, there are many species where we don't have enough genomic resources, not much at all. Just like they may be very important species, like many fruit and vegetable crops, medicinal crops, which we don't have absolutely no genome information, but it is required. If you have it, then you can make it much gain. For example, brinjal, guava, okra, even jamun, haldi, many things are there. Genome information is not there. So we have to start from the genetic resources. We need to have germplasm panels, mapping population, mutants line, very basic information, genome size, all these things you have to determine first before you can start doing. Then in the second phase, there are crops where we have the preliminary draft. What is called draft genome sequence. You isolate the genomic DNA and just do one run of Illumina. Now we have very high throughput genome sequencing techniques are available, like Illumina genome sequencing, PacBio, Oxford Nanopore. You will be studying these techniques. So we can actually generate huge amount of sequence information. Then you can assemble and get a preliminary kind of draft idea without those DNA sequences are not arranged into chromosome wise, but nonetheless you have maybe 60-70% up to 80% of the genome information in a fragmented form. That is also very, very useful for so many things. You can mine SSR markers, SNP markers, you can find genes in that. Lot of information you can get even with the not fully completely finished genome. And then you can start using that markers for your inbreeding and gene discovery. Then you can have an advanced draft. Advanced draft means you can have very high coverage. Rather than 60-70% coverage, you have more than 90% coverage. And then it moves towards the advanced draft, but still it is not the reference quality, because it may have lot of gaps, lot of unknown bases. So to get to this reference quality, for example, Arabidopsis, rice, or soybean, maize, there are very few crops where the very high quality reference genome is available, and rice is one of them. There the idea is to have each chromosome, how many pieces of DNA are there in each chromosome? Can you tell? Anybody? Each chromosome, eukaryotic chromosome, is a single piece of DNA. From one telomere to other telomere, it is a single molecule of DNA. It is coiled many times, so it becomes small, but the DNA is continuous. So when while sequencing, we have to break them into pieces, and then based on the overlap of the sequences, we reconstruct the whole chromosome, and that is called pseudomolecule, from telomere to telomere. So ideal pseudomolecule will be in one piece without no gap. And some of the chromosomes, like chromosome 8 of rice, was sequenced like that, without a single gap. Because some part of the chromosomes are very difficult to sequence, particularly those which are repetitive, like telomeres, centromeres, and other kinds of repeats. They are very difficult to sequence, and with newer techniques, somewhat become easier, but still, it is not that easy to sequence them. So ideally in one piece every chromosome, but as fewer gap as possible. So if you have more than 95-96% coverage and very few number of contigs, then you can call it a reference genome, which has been even anchored with the genetic map. That means you are not only sequencing, you are also using other methods like genetic mapping, and if all them should coincide with each other. So I'm not going into too much detail how to sequence the genome, but once we have a complete physical map of all the chromosomes from one end to other end with very few gaps, that is called the reference genome. And usually we need to have only one reference genome for each species. You don't need too many reference genome, but you need one reference genome with very high quality. So for other varieties we call resequencing. You can do at the low coverage and compare with that reference, and then you can see what is the polymorphism variation. So we don't need to create so many reference. Unless there are subspecies and these kind of different cultivar groups are there, then you can think of creating. But single reference, very high quality reference, for example, in case of rice, a Japanese variety was chosen called Nippon Bare, and that was used as a reference. So there is a timeline for the genome sequencing, and it is a long process, and it is a costly process, but very, very useful process one has to do. Now, why it is so difficult? Because of the very enormous size of the plant genomes. See, plant genomes, mostly they are some genomes are smaller, like Arabidopsis and rice. That's how they were sequenced first. Arabidopsis was taken because of its very small size as a model plant genome, and it was sequenced in 2000 itself, along with the human genome. It was the first plant genome to be sequenced. Most of the microbial genomes, like bacterial genomes, will be around 5 million base pairs. So now with the presently available techniques, even within a week you can finish a microbial genome. You can finish more than one in a single experiment. But as the size increases, you can see that tomato was 900 MB, human is 3 billion base pair, wheat is 17 billion base pair. So because of the polyploidy and lot of repetition in the genomes, many of the crop plants and tree species, they have huge genome size, and that's why it becomes very challenging to create a reference genome. So genome sequencing is like joining a jigsaw puzzle. In the jigsaw puzzle, if the picture is very small and pieces are large, then you can join very easily. Very few large pieces, and original picture is very large. But the picture is very large and pieces are very small, then it will be find very hard to join, because you are joining based on you are looking for the overlapping segments. And in very large genome with lot of repetitive DNA, one small piece can go and fit at many different places. So that is the real challenge. But nonetheless, now we have techniques with the very long read length, single molecule sequencing, and now it has become more easier and cheaper to assemble the genomes. But still, we have only about 50 completed plant genomes, and maybe less than 10 are of the reference quality. So there is a need to work on that to get a reference genome of the species which you are interested. And every year we have, in the month of January, in San Diego in USA, we have a plant and animal genome conference where 2,000 to 3,000 people come from all over the world, and they share the information about all kinds of genomes which are getting sequenced. So that is something worth following up. If you cannot go there, you can follow the abstract. It is available on the open access website. Now this is the value chain here, how we can use the genomic resources and the genetic resources. Genomic resource is the genome information, expression patterns, expression profiles, and all kinds of markers, polymorphism. This is genomic resource. And genetic resource is the germplasm, wild species, land races, varieties. And the purpose is to find the genes and use those genes to make better variety. So this is the timeline here, this is the value chain. The first step is to find the traits which are useful for us, because we want to develop variety which will have particular trait. It will have high yield, quality, disease resistance, these kind of things. So in the germplasm collections, you have thousands of different varieties. Then you have to find which variety has that particular trait. For that you do high throughput screening. So you cannot do this without doing the screening. You must have the germplasm. If you have only one variety, you cannot discover anything. You have to take a set of varieties which is varying for the trait, and normally the germplasm bank have those things. Like NBPGR has so many, more than 4 lakh successions. It is second biggest gene bank in the world. But if you screen it, and then you can find some variety which have a particular trait. That is called the trait discovery. And I will give you some example where how this kind of trait was found, then gene was found, then it was used. Second step is that gene discovery. Once you have a germ plasm, a genotype having a particular trait, then we need to know that what is the gene behind that trait, which is making that trait possible. Just like tall and dwarf, a particular color, particular nutritive value, resistant to particular stress. These are all governed by the genes. Even though genes interact with the environment, but the gene is the primary thing which gives that trait value. So that gene has to be discovered, and it is just like looking for a needle in the mountain of hay, in a haystack. And that gene discovery is made possible by having the genome information. So if you have the genome information, complete genome information, just like having a GPS map, then you can, that helps you to find the gene even into very large, and there are techniques. We don't have the time to go into detail how to find the genes in the genome. Not many genes have been found and validated. There are two things. One is that when you sequence a genome, you can find the genes in computer, like you can do gene annotation. You search for the sequence similarity. If a particular sequence matches with a known gene, then you say that this is that gene. So this is just totally in silico. But actual gene discovery is called when you isolate a gene, clone it, and do genetic transformation and prove that this gene is performing that function. So they are in just few hundreds in number, not more than 300-400 in rice. Even though we know 37,544 genes by computer analysis, but actually validation is not more than 400 genes so far. So that is called the gene discovery process, where a particular germplasm has a gene, and using different functional genomic tools, you can identify that segment of DNA which will perform a particular function. For that, we need to have segregating population, mutant lines. Now from the entire germplasm, we come back to just biparental crosses or mutants of a single germplasm. Then once you have identified the genes, then you go for the allele mining. What are the allele? Can anybody tell what is allele? How you define allele? That's good. Very good. So every gene has many forms. Just like if you say human beings have many forms, there are so many types of human beings. So similarly, a particular gene will have a lot of variations, because the gene may be 5 kilobases long, and there may be mutations leading to deletion, substitution. So each gene will have different alleles. The alternate forms will be there. And the alternate forms may have different properties. They will be governing the same trait, but at the two different levels. Some may be having from 0 value to 100%, or some even more. So we need to find the most useful form of that gene. So that is called allele mining. When the gene has got many forms, which form is suitable for you? And how will you find the alleles? You have to go back to the germplasm, because a single individual, if it is a diploid individual, it will have only 2 forms of a gene, both maternal and paternal chromosome. Because there is a pair of chromosomes, it can have maximum 2 alleles. If it is a polyploid, it may have more than 2 alleles, but still not too many. So you have to go back, but in the population, in the germplasm, different varieties may have different alleles. So when we start from the Mendel's time, Mendel described only 2 alleles for each genes, dominance and 2 alleles, and dwarf and tall, round and wrinkled, like that. But now we have come a long way. Even the multiple allele theory was discovered in the eye color in Drosophila and many other traits. But now we know that at the molecular level, every gene has multiple alleles. Even a single base change creates a new allele of that gene. So every gene you analyze, you find that there is a variation among the population. That variation may be meaningful, it may be non-synonymous substitution, or loss of function, or enhancement of expression, or it could be not meaningful. It will be synonymous substitution. The change is there but has no effect, but nonetheless it is there. So then once you find those kind of the superior allele, then you can use it in the molecular breeding. And breeding for this selection, you have gene-based marker, and whenever you cross the two varieties to develop a new variety, then you have to monitor that whatever you are selecting that has the particular desired allele or not. So there again, we can use this marker-assisted techniques like marker-assisted backcross breeding. You can use genomic selection, which is a coming up new tool. So among the breeding techniques, the most advanced are coming as a genomic selection, because you don't select for a single gene, you select for a number of genes which will make a better genotype. Similarly, genome editing. Genome editing is also possible by having the genome information, by having the information on the gene, where the defect lies or where you can make the editing so that it becomes a better gene. So that information, these are the tools, and then finally you will have a superior variety which will be used by the farmers and the consumers, and also the industry which uses the seed industry or processing industry. So this is the entire value chain where you get from germplasm resources, how you find the material which has a particular trait value, then find the genes behind that trait, then you find the better allele, then you do molecular breeding. So all these things, it's not that you are doing anything new here, because breeders have been doing this for hundreds of years. But only change is that you are doing it with great precision. Earlier breeders were crossing the two varieties, then they were selecting empirically without having the knowledge that where the gene is, which chromosome it is. Very little information, so it was a slow process. Now you have the capacity to find the actual exact gene and then follow it in a more holistic manner and more precise manner also. So now let's come to the second part. Very quickly, I will just, without going into detail, that the genome, now by this time you have realized that how important the genomes are to develop improved varieties and also to protect our germplasm and to have the knowledge. The genome, the whole genome science is started in the 1990s, towards the last decade of the last century, when the Arabidopsis genome and human genome projects were initiated in United States and some advanced countries. They made the network of countries to work on the genomes, because genome in sequencing was very, very costly and the whole thing was going to be in the public domain. So it was shared by the public institution, the job was shared, but unfortunately India was not partner to any of those efforts. Whereas all the leading countries like the Europe, America, even China and Japan, Germany, they were all partners. So India was lagging behind. For the first time in year 2000, we joined this genome kind of studies by taking part in the International Rice Genome Project. So to cut the long story short, we took the challenge of sequencing the long arm of chromosome 11 of rice. Rice has 12 chromosomes, and we did the long arm of chromosome 11. So IRI, our institute, and the Delhi University South Campus, we further shared. One part we did, the other part Delhi University did, and we completed this job. So this was a collaborative effort. So every country did their own part. So qualitatively, every country did the same work, but quantitatively, say Japan did 5 chromosomes, but we had to have a common standard, and you need to know all the techniques. You have to laboratories and skills at par with the rest of the world, so that you can achieve your target. And jointly, the rice genome was sequenced in 2002. It was launched in Japan, because Japan contributed the most. So Emperor of Japan actually inaugurated this genome in 2002. And in 2002 it was still a draft genome. and it was declared it was a draft genome. It took another 3 years to make it a reference genome, because the finishing of the genome is a slow process. You can generate the draft genome very quickly, even within a month you can generate. You take any species, isolate the DNA, have one run of Illumina, and do assemble them, this is draft is ready. Nowadays, that time the next NGS sequencing was not there. We had to do clone by clone sequencing. We have to clone each DNA in back clones, then plasmid clones. It was a very tedious process. Now it is not that hard. Now you can do NGS sequencing, but still going reference is very difficult. This was published in 2005, August. So now 14 years back now. And this has been a very useful, you can see here the 37,000 genes are there in rice by in silico prediction. And this has been used quite a lot. It has been cited by more than 2,000 work. Even it is used much more than it has been cited, because mostly people take the data from the NCBI, from the database. Then coming from that, the second was that was published in Nature in 2005. Then the second tomato genome also we took the job of sequencing the one full chromosome, chromosome 5 of tomato. This was published in 2012 also in Nature. But during this period here, during the tomato genome work, this next generation sequencing, what we call NGS, this revolution took place in 2008. So we had started the tomato genome work very into smaller clones, and then we proceed. But in 2008, it was possible to make things much faster, and this was completed. Then wheat genome was done. The draft was, wheat genome was very difficult to do. Even the 20 countries, and including a private company, they join hand to sequence the wheat, because it is 17,000 MB, 17 gigabase, 6 times bigger than the human genome, because of a lot of repetitions and polyploidy. So still in 2014, even with the availability of the NGS technology, it is very slow. The first draft appeared here in Science. Then it took another 4 years to develop the first reference genome of wheat in 2018, only last year. So we have participated in all of them, and there were more than 25 authors in the rice genome, similar number in the tomato genome, and in wheat also there are 18 authors from India including. This was done again with our institute, the South Campus, and the Punjab Agriculture University. Now those were done through international partnership, but we completed the first genome in India, first any eukaryotic genome, that was of the pigeon pea genome, and that was published in 2011. And we had used this next generation technologies, 454 pyro sequencing, to assemble the first draft of pigeon pea, and then we got 47,000 genes of the pigeon pea. Now this information, I'm just skipping how it was done totally, but more on the utilization part. So when we started in 2009, then there was not much genomic information in case of pigeon pea, because there are many crops which are important only for the developing nations. There are many crops which are even country specific, like pigeon pea is one such crop. More than 90% of the pigeon pea is produced and used. India is also largest importer and consumer of the pigeon pea, because it is consumed by many people as a dal, as a sambar, all over India. So that's why we selected this one. So we generated the genomic resources. We also made this high density map. You can see there is a dwarf pigeon pea, there is a medium height, there is a very tall ones also. But we map these genes here on chromosome 1 and chromosome 5. They are pleiotropic genes which affect the plant height, maturity and branching patterns. And they can be used in the breeding if you want to develop the dwarf pigeon pea variety. So based on this information, we have a breeding program at IRI to develop the dwarf varieties of pigeon pea which can be harvested by machines. Because normally the pigeon pea varieties are very tall and they are not suitable for mechanical operations. So first varieties was developed PADT 16, and now there are number of them are in the advanced testing through a DBT sponsored project. So the idea is that we can have high density map and you can identify the QTS genomic regions governing the trait. Another thing what we have developed is for the genotyping purpose, many people use SSR, simple sequence repeats, and other kinds of simple markers which you can do in agarose gels. But they are very slow process. You can do very few markers, and eventually if you see the large number of markers, it will be very costly also. So nowadays this genotyping is shifting more towards the SNP based genotyping, which is single nucleotide polymorphism, and they are the most abundant kinds of markers, and but they require a particular genotyping platform and they will be much cheaper per data point. So we have developed a chip, SNP chip for the pigeon pea, which has 62,000 markers, SNP markers, and there are different categories of genes, agronomically important genes, then single copy genes specific to pigeon pea, then conserved single copy, disease resistance genes. We don't have time to go into details of that, but there are total 62,000 genes. Another important thing about this chip is that we have taken multiple SNPs for each gene. So when you genotype multiple SNP from the gene, then you can find the haplotype information. Haplotype is nothing but the allele, because the SNPs are usually biallelic in nature. They are not only usually, they are almost surely biallelic, because very rarely they will have 3 or 4 alleles. But we know that every gene has multiple alleles. They don't have only 2 alleles. But each SNP has only 2 alleles. So most of the available chips which are available internationally, or people do genotyping using even GBS, so they will have only one SNP at a particular locus. They don't go for finding multiple SNPs for every gene unless it is a targeted resequencing. But this particular chips and the similar ones we have developed in rice and mango also, I will show you. Rice one was developed first and the patent has been filed. So we have a number of SNP on a gene. So haplotype is a combination of SNP. So a single SNP is biallelic, but if you take say 10 SNPs, then you have different combinations. Actually theoretically you have 2 raised to the power 10 combinations, but that doesn't happen because they don't combine freely. But usually you will have, if you have 10 SNP, you may have 10 haplotypes, even 15 haplotypes like that. So that means you are getting allelic information, which is not possible with the normal genotyping or random genotyping chips where you have only one SNP at one position. So one can do allele-based association mapping. You have one gene, the gene is associated with a trait, but which allele of that trait is associated. That information can also be obtained using this such chip. So, and the other thing is that you can do 96 sample, 12 times 8. I think many of the operations in molecular biology are done now using 96 well plate format. It is started as a microtiter plate for the ELISA, for antibody work, but now this is used very largely in all kinds of molecular biology work, because it becomes cheaper to do it in a 96 format rather than a single tube format, particularly when it comes to genotyping, other high throughput applications. So you can see here this is one particular SNP, And this cluster is the varieties. Their total 96 variety can be analyzed. So these are the variety which having the A allele, these are varieties having the B alleles, and these are the variety. Each spot represents a variety, and this many varieties are heterozygote for that. So each S and P which is biallelic in nature, you can have 3 score: A allele, B allele, and the H, which is the heterozygote. Similarly, 62,000 S and P can be scored for each variety. So this is a very high throughput analytical tool which can be used for all kinds of applications, for which any marker is used, this can also be used. Then see, we developed this high density map, and then more genes have been mapped for number of seeds per plant, certain yield related genes, and seeds per pod, number of branches, pod bearing length, these things have been mapped. Now another example like pigeon pea is the jute genome, which we completed here in collaboration with the Jute Institute in Barakpur, and this was also published in 2015 here. And you can see this, we have identified a QTL for the jute fiber quality. So basic principle is same. So I'm not going into detail because you have to have genome information, you have lots of marker, and you have a germ plot. Then using a standard technique, you can identify the genomic regions which govern the trait, which is called QTL. Or if you do further fine mapping and combine different functional genomics technique, you can identify the actual genes also. Now this another example, the latest one, which is not yet published, but it is published in the PAG conference proceedings, but the paper is still under preparation, is that we have taken the challenge of sequencing the mango. Mango is again, and this jute and pigeon pea work was done entirely within India with no international collaboration. And mango is also same. Mango is another species where it is largely very important for India. And there are many other countries also grow, but India is by far the largest producer of mango, and there is tremendous potential for processing and export. But because we don't have much genome information, not much scientific technology here, so there is a wastage of mango in the season, and there is a shortage in the off season. So prices fluctuate, and many people want to have mango, but we need to do a lot of work in terms of improvement and shelf life and so many other things. So we took the mango hybrid Amrapali. Mango is very highly heterogeneous, and also of course you can propagate it clonally, so each clone becomes the homogeneous in an orchard, but each tree is also heterozygous. There is a lot of heterozygosity is there, and that creates a big challenge in the sequencing. So when we sequenced the mango genome first time in 2014, the genome assembly was larger than the genome size, and that is because of the high heterozygosity. Some chromosomes, some part of the chromosome, both maternal chromosome and paternal chromosome, they were assembling separately because they were not very similar. They were too different from each other. So software thinks that they are two different chromosomes. But later on, we use long read sequencing technologies like the Pacific Biosciences. So this is the third revolution in the genome sequencing. In the first one, we used to clone and sequence. That's called clone by clone sequencing. When the 2008, you got this PCR-based amplification. The cloning was replaced by PCR. And then that's called NGS sequencing. Now the third generation, even PCR is not required. You just take the DNA and without amplification you sequence it. This is called single molecule sequencing. An example is the Pacific Biosciences, where you can get read length up to 10 kilobases, and there will be one DNA molecule and one DNA polymerase plus DNTPs in a very small well on the chip, and then you can read by the imaging. Sequence is read by the imaging as the DNA gets extended and the nucleotide gets incorporated. So these are very nano scale technologies being applied in genome sequencing. So with the help of that long read, now we resolve that problem because we allowed for the mismatch. We don't go for the 100% match. We allow the mismatch to take care of heterozygosity. And then we were able to assemble the genome, mango genome. Again, I don't have time to go into detail. 403 mbp total assembly was there. And we can calculate coverage by different, there are methods of covering, finding out that what percentage of genome has been complete. One is we need the genome size and then how much we have assembled, that is the state calculation. But also based on the transcriptome data, that how much of the transcripts are covered, the random set of transcript, how many random set of markers are covered. And there is a set of the inversely conserved genes which is called the BUSCO analysis. This is the benchmark orthologous set of genes. You see that what percentage of genes are covered in your assembly, that all gives an idea of that what percentage of genome you have finished. So by all standard, more than 95-96% of the mango genome was covered in our assembly. And this genome has been anchored to genetic map using the Chinese map. The Chinese scientists have developed very high density map of marker using target amplified sequencing. They have created a map of more than 6,000. So we use this map to anchor the genome, and you can see, I will just show you one chromosome. Mango has 20 chromosomes and total 400 MB size. So each chromosome is about 20 MB in size. So here is the 0 to 168 centimorgan. This is the genetic map from China. And this is the 22 MB, from 0 to 22 MB. This is the assembly which we prepared, the physical map. And you can see there is 1:1 alignment here. The genetic map is perfectly corresponds with the physical map. And this is the plot here, two-dimensional plot. You can see this part here, where the centimorgan, this is very less centimorgan for nearly 5 MB of genome. That means recombination frequency is less in this part of the chromosome. And that is indicative of the centromere. So recombination frequency is less near the centromere and more towards the telomere. So similar picture you get for all the 20 chromosomes. So that is the value of anchoring and combining the genetic map with the physical map. There are other techniques also like optical mapping and high C sequencing. They are all independent methods of verifying the genome assembly. Now similar to what I showed you about the pigeon pea, we developed a mango chip also, and it has got 80,000 SNPs on that. 96 samples you can do, and it has very high sample success rate. All 96 out of 96, all the sample pass, they all work because of the very precise nature of this assay which we have developed. Now we have analyzed nearly 400 varieties of mango. There is a great diversity in mango. You can see very small like arm bear to big size, and very popular ones like Alfonso, Kesar, Neelam, Dasari. No time to go into more detail of that. But the horticulturist had characterized these mango varieties through morphological traits. The fruit size, then this fiber length here, the leaf length, all kinds of things which they could do without the genomics, they had done it. But all of that is not very useful because we don't know that which gene is controlling which chromosome it is, how we can make use in the breeding. But with the help of this genome information and using that ATK chip, now we have started finding the chromosomal location of the genes. Because we found one QTL for fruit acidity, which makes the fruit sour or sweet. There is an acidity index on one of these chromosomes here with very high log value. We can give a very high predictive value on chromosome 12. Then we found QTL for fruit length on one of these chromosomes here, you can see. And then we found 3 QTLs for pulp percentage. Like if the mango is there, what is the ratio of pulp to stone? You want the stone to be small and more pulp. So there are 3 genes for that. So similarly, these are just 3 examples. Having very high density SNP chip, you can map it very precisely on the chromosome and which part of the chromosome. Still we don't know the which gene, but this is the first step. Then you have to use a set of techniques to get to the gene. Okay? Still more to go. Time is running out. Now the third part is that what is wrong with the high-yielding varieties. You hear a lot by the many people, they criticizing the green revolution. They say that the green revolution has not done much good to us because it encouraged the use of a lot of chemical fertilizers and pesticide, and because of the green revolution we lost all our traditional varieties which were so good and so tasty and very healthy. These are the general kinds of comments you will get from any lay person. But strictly, all of those comments are 100% wrong. Because of the green revolution only, if it wasn't there, you will not have enough food to eat for such a growing population. The second thing is that at that time the priority was to get the productivity only. So less attention was paid for other traits like climate resilience or quality traits. In fact, they were not selected during Green Revolution. All the selection was for yield only, and to some extent for disease resistance and other thing. Some of the factors which reduce the yield performance. So there were field level screening was done, and when we selected these high yielding varieties, the semi-dwarf varieties in rice and in wheat. So the new varieties definitely they have the yield advantage in the high input condition, like you have to give a lot of irrigation and fertilizer. So the general logic is that if you want certain output, you have to get certain amount of input. If you don't give the fertilizer and irrigation, you are not going to get yield. The only thing you can do is to improve the efficiency of water use efficiency and fertilizer use efficiency. So with the less amount of fertilizer and water, you get more yield. But you cannot make yield from nothing. So that is one conceptually what was wrong. But there are many genes which were lost during Green Revolution because we did not select from them. So it is absolutely true that traditional variety has many good things. There are many quality attributes. They have resilience to climate thing, which we had lost because we selected for high yield under high input conditions. And in the breeding station, there is no limitations of water or fertilizer. They only want the maximum yield. So that was a negative thing, but that was a necessity to feed the population. Now we are armed with a lot of knowledge about the growing knowledge about the use efficiency, nutrient use efficiency, the quality, resistance. So we can go back and add those value to varieties. Now we can combine the high yield with the resilience and the quality and the resistance. So that's where the genomics knowledge and the germplasm resources will be very useful because the good genes are scattered in so many different varieties. Even in traditional varieties, maybe one variety is good for one thing and it is resistant to one thing, other one is for something else. All the good things were not there in one place. That's why even if I give all the varieties to a farmer today, they will not cultivate any one of those old varieties. All of them are preserved in gene bank here in NBPGR. More than 1 lakh rice varieties are there. So people who make a comment that we have lost all the variety, we have not lost any one of them. We have only lost from the farmer's field, but they have been preserved. They have been collected and preserved. And even if I give it to the farmer today, he will not cultivate that one because he chose the better ones for their high yielding performance. Now you have to combine the high yield with the resilience and the quality, then he will prefer that. Okay. So you can see I am just giving example of rice only. There are certain varieties of rice which are called mega varieties of rice because they are cultivated, they are so popular among the farmers, even not only within India but outside India also. They are cultivated in more than 1 million hectares. Sometimes the particular wheat variety is cultivated in more than 10 million hectares, like 2967 from IRI. So they have very good resilience, very good adaptability and high yield, all those things. But they are very popular with the farmers. Okay, as against the traditional variety which have high level of stress tolerance but poor agronomic performance. So farmers are reluctant to grow this variety. So what we have to do, we have to find the good genes from these traditional varieties and also the wild relatives and put back into that so that these varieties, they become acceptable. So how are we going to do it? That is the breeding. So you will be having lectures on the breeding also. You are also breeding student, many of you. So you will be knowing very basic one. But when it comes to marker assisted breeding, it has found actually, the breeding is a numbers game. You know how many samples you have to handle. In the traditional pedigree breeding, you have to cross two parents. Normally the breeders will take two good variety. They cross elite with the elite. And then in the segregating population, they will select the right combination. Then the recurrent selection is used in the cross-pollinated crops mostly. Then genomic selection is also coming, it's a new technique coming up because you need to know the breeding value of each marker. So practically it has not been used. We don't have many examples of the variety released by genomic selection, but this is a promising future, just like genome editing is coming up. Then this particular technique, marker assisted backcross breeding, is the one which has delivered maximum number of varieties so far. I will give you some examples. Like you can do the limited number of backcrossing, maybe 3 to 4 backcrosses, and then you can recover more than 96-97% of the genome of the recipient variety. Whereas in the traditional backcross breeding, you have to make 8-9 backcrosses for that amount of recovery. So that's what the marker assisted backcrossing saves that time of the number of backcrosses required to develop a near isogenic lines with the added value. And backcross breeding is a very common kind of methodology used when you have to transfer a trait from an unacceptable germ plant. It could be a variety with very low performing yield, maybe a traditional variety, very tall, lodging type, very low yield, but having some good trait. Then you have to cross and backcross. Similarly, from wild, definitely you have to backcross. If you are trying to transfer there are certain calculation here which I wanted to point out. Say, when you cross, take a elite variety of rice or any other thing, for this example rice, and you cross it to a variety which is very poor, but it has one good trait. And you know that the rice has got so many genes, thousands of genes are there, they will be all segregating. When you cross them in the progeny, they will be all segregating. And what is the chance of recovering that original variety? If you suppose cross a good variety, for example Swarna or Samba Masuri, with a land race, so when you cross them, it becomes heterozygote for many of the genes, and they start segregating depending on their linkage or other thing. So the simplest scenario here is that you can have only one gene on each chromosome arm segregating. So all the genes present on the 12 chromosomes will segregate independently because the independent assortment of the chromosomes. But if the one gene is on the long arm and the other one is on the short arm end, they will also segregate independently because almost 50% recombination there is also there. So theoretically you can have 24 pairs of genes which will segregate independently. So how many combinations they will make? Because the Mendel's you have only have a checkerboard of 2 genes. Diallyl you get 16 combinations because there will be 4 alleles and then 16 genotypes will be there. So that itself is hard enough. But when you have 2 raised to the power 24, you will get more than 16 million combinations. And only one combination is like original Swarna. So it is, you cannot think, whenever you cross a good variety with a bad variety, the whole thing gets so much jumbled up and becomes messed up that you cannot recover the original variety. So that's why the backcross breeding method is useful. But when you backcross that onto Swarna again, so this 16 million becomes 8 million. So already you have got rid of 8 million. One more backcross, another 4 million. So every generation you are not bothered about that how many useless combinations were there. So by backcrossing you eliminate them very fast. So in 3-4 back crosses you eliminate most of them, but then after that you need to have a marker and other thing to become more precise. But if you think that like a pedigree breeding, within the F2 derived progeny you can select, you can forget about it. And that's why most breeders who are using in pedigree breeding, usually you will be crossing elite with the elite because you don't have too many undesirable type. Still you get many undesirable, but if you cross elite with the exotic or poor, then definitely you have so many undesirable things that back cross breeding. So this is the methodology which was used, which has been successful so far in transferring the traits from a poor background into good background. And this is the variety which has become quite popular in very short time. Is called Swarna Sub-1. Now Swarna is a very high yielding variety grown, it's a mega variety grown in millions of hectares and very high yielding, very popular among the farmers still, more than 40 years. Now this donor FR13A was identified, which is tolerant to flooding. If the rice is submerged for 2 weeks, still it will not dry, it will become dormant. And then when the flood recedes, the rice will again regenerate and produce the normal yield. Whereas without that gene, there will be zero yield will be there. So this gene, the donor was identified in 1970. Then breeding lines and mapping was developed in 1990s. And the gene, Sub-1 gene actually was cloned in 2006. After the rice genome sequencing became available, then this gene was cloned. So now we know precise gene, which is the gene which makes it flood tolerant. And this is the pathway, you see how much time it has taken. Now it may take lesser time, but having genome information made it faster. Then 2009, within 3 years, the varieties were developed. Normally it will take 10-15 years to develop a variety, even if you know the genes by back-crossing anything. Because of the marker-assisted foreground selection for the presence of this allele of Sub-1 gene, and also background selection for the recovery of the recurrent parent, you could, within 3 years the varieties were released. And this kind of things like the original Swarna variety, this is small segment having the Sub-1 gene. This was possible. But still with the conventional back-cross breeding, still you will transfer about 1 MB, 1 to 3 MB segment, because the recombination will be very, very low in the small region. So that's where the techniques like genome editing are useful, where you can take the clone that gene and transfer it precisely where you want without disturbing. So that can be done in just one generation. Still you need time to multiply the seeds, so you need few generations. In a single plant you create, but then you have to create large amount of seeds. So there is something you cannot get over. But your precision could be increased by having techniques like genome editing. So this particular, it was shown very successfully that when we transfer that gene, Sub-1 gene, then the flood sensitive variety will become flood tolerant. So there are it was transferred in number of backgrounds like Samba Masuri, IR64, IR42, and in each of these backgrounds with the variable level of thing, the gene with the Sub-1 was tolerant. After 2 weeks of complete flooding, when the water was taken off, those with the Sub-1 gene, they recovered and produced yield. Without the Sub-1 genes, either they died completely or only just little bit survived. This is one of the classical examples of marker-assisted breeding to transfer a gene for climate resilience from a traditional land race into a modern high-yielding variety. So this is one example. There's many genes can be done like that. Now for the background selection, this is the rice chip which we developed here, very similar to the pigeon pea and mango chip. Again, this has got 50,000 SNPs. We use this chip to analyze the background of these 4 varieties which were developed by IRI. In fact, these were developed by the IRI in collaboration with Indian breeders. Out of this, the Swarna Sub-1 actually became very popular. The others did not become so popular. And if you can see the analysis here regarding the background recovery. This is chromosome-wise, chromosome 1 to chromosome 12. And how much recovery is there of the chromosome in Swarna Sub-1, IR64 Sub-1, Savitri sub 1 and Samba Masuri sub 1. You can see the Swarna sub 1, 97% of the recurrent parent genome was recovered. Whereas in case of Samba Masuri, only 79% was recovered. Even though they had used the SSR markers to do that analysis. So with the SSR marker they had sufficient recovery, but if you use the high density SNP chip, then you actually know that at least there is a 10% variation in that recovery. So now this is the methodology. I just gave you example of the Swarna sub 1, but similarly we have used to transfer the genes per high grain number, and which the candidate genes have been identified, but I will not go into detail. Then transfer into 12 different backgrounds. In each background, this gives high grain number, bigger panicles, and the yield also enhanced 10 to 15%. You can see here in the mega variety we have transferred 1121, Samba Masuri, Swarna. This is one of the example here. This is the gene. This is the background which has been recovered blue except for one or two regions. Then in the QTL2 variety, this program was extended. There are 15 institute network program where we try to transfer the genes per this sub 1 gene, plus also there are QTLs for the drought tolerance. There are 7 QTLs. DTY, the yield under drought. Here we don't know the genes, but we know the genomic regions. So even we don't have to wait till we find the genes. We can start transferring these QTLs, small segment, and then number of QTLs per drought tolerance and one for salt tolerance, one for sub 1. They were transferred. This is the strategy. Limited 3 back crosses and then doing foreground selection like this. Tightly linked SSR markers. So we had conducted all the polymorphism survey and give the information to the partner breeding institute that you need to have this peak marker and 2 flanking marker to select for the presence of the QTL. And then we do the background selection for the recovery of the background. And then some fine mapping work was also done because we are running short of time here. This particular SD1 gene which led to green revolution, this was very, very tightly linked with the gene for the drought tolerance. So when we selected these dwarf varieties, we lost this drought tolerance because they are very, very tightly linked with that. So we were able to recombine. Now we have the dwarf lines using this fine mapping procedure. We were able to separate the two SD1 gene and the DTY QTS. Now we have the lines which are dwarf, but they are tolerant. Otherwise the dwarf lines, this is the original dwarf line, were sensitive to drought. But after that recombination, you can have the dwarfing gene with that tolerant allele of the QTL, and these are under testing. This was done by the IGKB Raipur in this particular collaboration. Now on the last part, I will just go a little bit faster here, because now you understand the basic principle is that using the genome information, we try to search for the genes in the germ plug and then try to make use of it in developing the new variety. So here in case of rice, the wild, not only rice, in any crop species, the wild species, wild relatives are much richer in the variation, because there is 2 kinds of bottlenecks in the one is called breeding bottleneck and other one is called domestication bottleneck. So when we were hunters and gatherers, maybe more than 10,000 years back or 15,000, we cannot exactly tell. But from the present knowledge, it seems that agriculture was first invented not more than 20,000 years back, maybe around 10,000 years back. Before that, humans were hunters and gatherers because they were just collecting and eating from the natural variability. But when the agriculture was started, they started cultivating, then they did domestication. So from the grasses, they picked up something which can be cultivated. So one of the things was that you need non-shattering type of rice, because wild rice just shatters. So similarly in wheat also you need pre-threshing. So there are certain domestication trait. Early farmers selected that and then they started cultivating. So that is one bottleneck. Out of thousands of variability available, you just chose one mutation which has the desirable type. So then you left behind all the variation, so that you have a narrow genetic base. The second one is the breeder's bottleneck. So the traditional farmers has hundreds and thousands of varieties. Then breeder came and he selected only one variety which is cultivated in 10 million hectares, which became the mega variety. So there are two kinds of bottleneck this breeding has gone through. One the domestication bottleneck, and the second one is the breeding bottleneck, which reduce the genetic variability. So if you go back to the wild, then we can recover those variability. So the wild species have lot more variability than the cultivated, because of the domestication and breeding bottleneck. So I had taken this project in the National Professor to collect a lot of wild rice from different parts of the country. Now rice has 25 wild related species with different genomes like A genome, C genome, G genome. And you will have a copy of this presentation, so you don't need to worry about noting. There are 6 species which are A genome, which are easily crossable with the cultivated rice, which is Oryza sativa, which is also A genome. So there is a lot of variability which can be used. In fact, our modern variety already have many of the genes coming from wild, including grassy stemmed virus and the XA21 genes. Like this, there are a number of genes are there, some brown plant hopper, which are coming from the wild. Even in the nature also, there are natural outcrossing, and the traditional farmers have selected. So based on the chloroplast genome, we can work out the phylogeny of this all the Oryza species. If you use maize as Gia maize as an outgroup, then you can see which is the old species of rice and which is the new ones. In fact, this Oryza sativa is the latest divergence, and Oryza sativa, indica, japonica, these varieties, they are the most recently evolved one. Eventually, all of them will go back to a common lineage. Okay, you can even draw the timeline that how many million years ago this evolved from the other one, based on the synonymous substitution rate. So this particular Oryza rufi Pogan, Grief, Oryza nivara, Sharma and Shastri, this is the most widely available within India, and I explored that and collected from many parts, from Himachal Pradesh to UP, to Odisha, Jharkhand, all over the country. And this is a resource which is depleting very fast because of the development. So it is only present in the wherever there is no development, there is no farming, some free land is there, it will be growing there. Mostly on the roadside or some lowland area. And in fact, I found more wild rice in the cities where the area has been earmarked for some development, but is still not fully developed, so there some wild rice is growing. So as soon as that house is built or school is built or some factory is built, that will be also gone. So then what is you can see today in Jharkhand or Odisha, it will become like Haryana and Punjab, so you do not say any wild rice. So this is one resource which is depleting very fast because for farmers it is a weed. The farmers also don't like this thing, they want to get rid of it. So that's why advanced farmers have got rid of it already. But the farmers did like to have their own variety, traditional variety. Many of them still cultivate them, but nobody likes this one, which is 10 times more variable and valuable than the traditional variety, because immediately nobody can see this benefit. And the development is its biggest enemy. So unless we preserve some areas where it can grow naturally, we are going to have problem in the future. So India has been divided into 15 agroclimatic zones by the Planning Commission, and I have collected from 11 of those zones, some of like Rajasthan and other places. There is not much wild rice and I have not been able to reach there also. So nearly 800 we have collected and we have characterized, we have grown them here and developed a database. Then we did phylogenetic analysis using this 50K SNP chip, and we found that there are 3 different populations. The red one is Pro-Indica, from which the Indica type variety have evolved. I'm just cutting the long story short here. And the green one is the wild rice, which are the ancestor of the Aus type variety. You know, the rice varieties are divided into Aus, Indica, Japonica, Aromatic, like there are 6 cultivar groups are there. So at least 2 group of cultivars, Aus and Indica, they have evolved within India from our wild rice resources. These are one of the new things which came through our high density fingerprinting analysis. Before that, Chinese had published a paper in Nature actually. You can see here in 2015, they published a paper claiming that all rice has originated in South China, and from there it has gone to the whole world. So sometimes you can make use of the knowledge to mislead the people. So suppose if you did not know what is the genome, how many genes are there, how to study the domestication and things, then you will have to believe the Chinese because they know more than you, so they can mislead you. But when we published this paper, which I just showed you, just slightly after this paper, because they had 3-4 papers, one in Nature, one in PNAS and some other. Even though before this, for a long time, based on the theory of Babylog, it was believed that rice has originated in the Indo-Burmese center of origin. And at the best, it has polyphyletic origin, maybe Indica one here and Japonica one in Southeast Asia. But the Chinese, they turned the whole thing upside down, that all rice has originated in South China, and from there it has migrated to the whole world. So using that analysis, and I will just show you this example, which is the very important example. One of the domestication trait is white pericarp. So all the wild rice has got the red pericarp, but the cultivated one, they have the white. That's why the grain looks white. Even before milling, it will be white or slightly off-white. So this is many varieties have got this particular allele haplotype. These haplotypes were determined by the chip only, because this gene responsible for the aileron color, we had a number of SNPs on that, and we can work out there are 4 haplotypes. So this particular haplotype is present only in Aus variety, and this also gives you the white pericarp. So that means this has got a separate origin than the other varieties. So this is called polyphyletic origin. So all rice did not originate in one place, they are independent origins of domestication and cultivation. Similarly, the GBSS gene, there is a convergent selection, because in the nature there is a uniformity, and in the cultivation there is a diversity. So by and large, in general, the rule is that the wild will have more diversity than the cultivated. But there are certain genes where there is a selection in the wild, because in the wild, if rice is to survive, it may need a particular type of starch synthase gene, because that has an advantage in survival in nature. But in the human being, they may have selected for different varieties, because somebody wants to eat poha, somebody wants sticky rice, somebody wants basmati rice, and this all quality variations due to different kinds of starch. It's a very, very typical example here. You can see the cultivated, we have taken very few, and there are number of alleles are there, but all the wild had a single allele. So this is a very significant observation, made possible only because we had number of SNPs on the same gene, and we can do haplotype analysis of that. Then after our paper came, then scientists from UK, they did re-analysis of that same Chinese data, and they showed that the Chinese had got it wrong. In fact, rice has a polyphyletic origin, at least 3 different origins. So only one kind of rice may have evolved in South China, probably more likely in Vietnam, but the Aus and Indica, they have evolved here in India. Same data could be reinterpreted. So that shows that how to you can put value to your germ plant and even correct the history, where scientists even can mislead the history, natural history, not the actual history of the Babar and Humayun, but the history of the natural history, how the things have evolved in nature. So in this, the real use of these resources is that if you have to do the trait discovery. So we screened for drought tolerance here. We found wild rice which were tolerant to drought. Then we did allele mining, one of the transcription factor, DREB1, which is known to contribute to drought tolerance. And we amplified it, and we found that certain alleles were associated with the drought tolerance. Then for anaerobic germination, we screened all these accessions, and we found a number of lines which were much more highly tolerant to anaerobic germination as compared to even the best checked variety of the cultivated. Similarly, in submergence tolerance also, there are some of the lines like NKWR117 which was highly tolerant. You can see here BRC, all the others had died. Then salt tolerance, we found two lines, one from Himachal Pradesh, one from UP, which is more tolerant than the highly tolerant land race, which is Pokhali. So I'm just going quickly to show you that this is a very, very important resource, genetic resource, wild rice which we have collected, and it has got all kinds of trait values. Then you have to find the genes and make use in the breeding. This is the BLB, bacterial blight resistance. 13 highly resistant lines were identified. Even sheath blight, we don't have resistance in the cultivated gene pool, but some of these lines, they were highly tolerant. And then some of our scientists, they are making the crosses. Then salt tolerant genes, the allele mining has been done, and the superior allele has been identified. In one of the examples, this salt tolerant gene present in this particular wild rice, we have made the backcross1 population. So in the backcross1 derived population, you have to do phenotyping in the progeny because it's a destructive method. So BC1 F2 family, the phenotyping was done, and BC1 F1, the genotyping was done using 50K SMP chip. So to do the mapping, you need to do both genotyping and phenotyping. In the F2, you cannot do phenotyping because there is a single plant. But in F2, here the F1 is equivalent to F2 in the backcross situation. And this F2 is like the F3, F2 derived F3. So the full genotyping, phenotyping was done. And then you can see this is segregation for salt tolerance. This is the population where the transferred from the wild rice. Okay. Then this is the chip platform which we used it. Genotype like this. We identified the markers which are segregating in 1:1 ratio. So out of 50,000 markers, you don't have to bother about which are not behaving nicely. We found about 1100 markers which were behaving nicely 1:1, and we made the map based on that. And then you can identify this QTL here were identified on chromosome 1 and chromosome 3, and they are contributed by the wild rice. They were not present in the cultivated rice, which were making it tolerant to the salt tolerance. Then candidate genes are also there here. They need to be validated by transformation. So this is the story of the wild rice, which I showed you how they were collected. They were screened for different traits, and I gave you one example how this can be used by backcrossing. You can identify the QTLs and be precise and even identify the genes. But these things will take time, but it's a valuable resource. For each of the traits which I just showed you, they can be just mobilized into the high-yielding variety background. This is from the QTL to variety program. There are 4 varieties have been released. Samba Masuri with both combining drought and submergence tolerance. Then Ranjit Sub-1, Bahadur Sub-1. They are the very popular variety from Assam here. But Sub-1 gene has been put. Now it has become like a flood tolerant, like the Sarna Sub-1. So this is becoming very popular. And you can see this DRR150, which is tolerant to both drought and flood, and it is becoming very popular in eastern India, except that it has a problem of this disease, false smut. So this year, the false smut was actually very, very predominant because of the high rainfall. So then we have to find a solution for that, otherwise farmers will reject it. So any undesirable trait and they will reject it. So this is second last slide. I know this your tea is getting late, I think. The future direction, what is the future direction? Is that of course we have to work at each step. Like this is the example of rice, which is the most advanced in terms of genomics, because genome was published in 2005. But many crops in wheat genome was only published last year, and many important crops genome has not been published. So you can expect of similar gains in other species also with the time lag, like mango, pigeon pea, all will go through the similar gains, and we will make similar progress as is done in the case of rice. In case here now, in case of rice, now we have to combine multiple QTLs. One example like flood and drought we have shown, but you can combine yield also, we can compile for disease resistance. All these things are possible. If one thing is possible, everything is possible. Only thing one has to do it and take your time and dedication and effort, so it can be done. And another thing is that to train human resource capacity building is also a part of that program. Because through this kind of interactions and working together and getting trained, this continued process, like breeding is a continuous process against the nature. Just like in the nature, evolution is taking place in response to the changing climate or changing different kinds of environmental pressure, the species have evolved. Similarly, breeding is what breeding is defined. One definition of breeding is that evolution under captivity. Like the breeder does what? It just does the evolution. It evolves a variety depending on the need. So then again, he does it with the knowledge, particularly with the genomics knowledge available. You can change the genotype of the variety to suit your human requirement. And that is can be speeded up greatly by using the modern technologies like genomics and genetic manipulation. You can speed up further. You don't need to do back crossing. You take all the good genes and through genome editing put them all together in Swarna. But then you need to know what are those all good genes and where to put. So easier said than done, but the tools are now becoming available. So again, one thing I would like to, before I finish, to emphasize that as a scientist or as a student, you should always, because you are in the position where you can lead the society. In this society, when you have discussion with the people, you can explain it to them that what is right, what is wrong. Because there is a lot of misinformation about science. Particularly in present dispensation, there is even more misconception. That 1,000 years ago we were better than what we are today, which is not the fact. Because science and technology has contributed so much to the advancement, and we should not become anti-science. So wherever there is some people are misleading that, these all new things are bogus and we were better off, 500 years back, this is totally absurd. And as a student, as a science student and teacher, you should always speak out and tell what is good in the science and why we should do science, why you are doing PhD. You are not simply doing just to get a job. Job will come, but your purpose is different. Your purpose is to serve the society with the trained, with the proper training in the right direction, using the right tools. That is our goal and destination. And while doing so, everybody gets the job. But everybody gets job, everybody gets their earning. But what you do, to get that thing is very important. Even people who throw stones or they campaign, spread wrong things, they also get money for that. So they are paid for doing wrong things, but you can get paid and rewarded for doing the right things for the right future of the thing. But don't keep silent when there's a discussion, there's something, don't fight with people, but then argue and convince people. First you have to be convinced yourself. Then you can also try to convince the others. If you yourself are in two minds, like I gave you example of some students, which I say that there's a BT brinjal, there's a normal brinjal, which you will prefer? Then he say he will prefer the normal one. Why? Because there's a doubt in his mind that this could be wrong, this could not be good for me. And this is about the PhD students. We have done MSc Biotechnology trying to get admission in PhD. So be convinced, not because I am telling, with your own mind, with your own intellect. If you have the knowledge, then you try to go deeper into things and make an objective judgment and make your opinion and then spread that to the society, because you are the selected and chosen one. Less than 0.001% come under your category. The masses can be misled by so many false leaders. Okay? So I have taken, I think, almost more than half an hour extra, but hope it was useful. Thank you so much. Any question anybody has? Quick question? I don't know.
If you have any question, you can ask.
Well, one question.
Marker assisted background
That's a very good question. Actually, in my experience and some other people experience also, the background selection, the foreground selection should be performed throughout, right from the beginning. And it should be validated with as far as possible, whenever possible, by phenotypic selection also. But for the background selection, it is better to leave it towards the end. Because in the first two back classes, 2 or 3 back classes, the background recovery is so fast that you don't need to select. And you can do a visual selection as Breeder does the phenotypic selection. You look for the plants which are looking very similar to the recipient parent. There is no need to apply any molecular markers because it will be waste of time and money. But so background selection you do at the BC3 stage, like you select say 20, what we are doing in the QTL2 variety program, we ask the bidder to select the 20 best line which he has selected based on his visual selection for the background similarity with the recipient parent. Of course, he has to do the foreground selection to ensure that the gene is there. And then at the BC3, F2 or F3 stage, out of those 20 best lines, we select the one which has got maximum similarity with the background, with the recipient parent. And we find that in almost all cases, there is about 10% variation. What breeder thinks is all very similar to recipient parent. Among those 20 lines, there is still 10% variation, which is invisible to the breeder, which is visible only to the marker. So background selection, you should do very high density background selection, like using chips, etc. But do it at the BC3 and beyond stage. And foreground selection right from the beginning, like even testing the hybridity of the F1, then in BC1, BC2, BC3, there will be normally 1:1 segregation. And then you use that marker.
So basically, we done all of the 3 selection in each and every generation. That's you mean?
Not all 3.
Not all 3.
Background selection towards the end.
Okay.
Foreground selection and recombinant selection in BC1, BC2, and BC3.
Okay. And my another question that sir, what is that DNA chip? It is some kind of microarray technique or?
These are microarray
Micro.
from Affymetrix.